On a freezing November night in 1581, the most feared ruler on earth destroyed his own dynasty with a single furious swing of a metal staff. The man who took that blow was not a rebel or an assassin, but his favorite son and the only hope for Russia's future. Inside the dark halls of the Alexandrov Kremlin, screaming echoed off cold stone walls, and nobody dared to stop what was happening. By the time the sun came up, a pregnant princess was bleeding on the floor, and the young heir lay dying in his father's arms. How did a minor family argument turn into a bloodbath that doomed an entire empire to chaos? To understand this tragedy, you have to picture the fortress of Alexandrov Sloboda, 80 miles northeast of Moscow. This was not a warm golden royal palace. It was a dark, fortified compound, surrounded by dense forests and guarded by ruthless soldiers. The ruler sitting on the throne was Tsar Ivan IV, famously known across history as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan was 51 years old, but his body was falling apart from illness, constant paranoia, and violent rages. He had spent decades executing his nobles, burning down entire cities, and suspecting everyone around him of treason. Yet, through all the madness and bloodshed, Ivan deeply loved one person above all others, his 27-year-old son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. The young prince looked just like his father, shared his brilliant mind, and had been trained since childhood to rule the Russian lands. He rode into battle beside the Tsar, helped manage the royal court, and knew every secret of his father's empire. Ivan trusted the young man completely, and saw him as the strong, capable leader who would keep the family on the throne. The Tsar had even arranged his son's marriage to Yelena Sheremeteva, a noblewoman who was now heavily pregnant with the future heir. Everything seemed secured for the bloodline, but inside the dark stone rooms of Alexandrov, a single spark was about to burn it all down. It was November 15th, 1581, and a bitter frost covered the fortress windows. The old Tsar walked down the dimly lit hallway, his heavy iron-tipped wooden staff tapping loudly against the floor. Ivan used this heavy staff as a walking stick, but he also used it as a deadly weapon whenever someone made him angry. He pushed open the heavy wooden door into the private rooms of his daughter-in-law, Yelena. The young princess was resting alone, wearing only a light, loose house dress because the indoor stove was burning hot. In 16th century Russia, royal women were expected to wear multiple layers of heavy clothing at all times to show modesty. When the paranoid Tsar saw Yelena in her simple garments, something in his unstable mind instantly snapped. He did not ask questions and he did not listen to reason. He accused her of shaming the entire royal house. Ivan raised his wooden staff and began beating the pregnant woman across her shoulders and back. Her desperate screams echoed down the long hallway, reaching the ears of her husband, Tsarevich Ivan. The young prince ran into the bedchamber and found his father violently attacking his crying, defenseless wife. Imagine the absolute shock and panic in the room as the young man threw himself between his father and the staff. He grabbed the old Tsar by the arms, shouting at him to stop and begging him to spare his wife and unborn child. The prince yelled that Ivan had already ruined his previous marriages, and he would not let him harm this family. That defiance crossed a line that the old tyrant could never forgive in anyone. Ivan the Terrible saw his own son's bravery not as family love, but as total rebellion against his absolute power. His eyes went wide with blind rage, and the shouting inside the bedchamber grew deafening. A high-ranking noble named Boris Godunov heard the chaos and rushed in, trying desperately to pull the Tsar back. Ivan swung his iron staff sideways, slashing Boris across the face and sending him crashing to the floor, covered in blood. With nobody left standing between them, the Tsar turned all his furious energy toward his own flesh and blood. He raised the heavy, pointed staff high into the air and brought it crashing down with terrifying force. The sharp metal tip struck the young prince directly in the temple with a sickening crack. The prince dropped instantly, his skull fractured, and a thick pool of dark blood began spreading across the wooden floor. In that single, terrible second, the red fog in the Tsar's brain vanished completely. Ivan froze, staring down at his favorite boy lying motionless at his feet, fighting for every single breath. The tyrant fell to his knees on the bloody floor and pulled his dying son tightly against his chest. He pressed his hands against the deep wound in the boy's head, screaming out for doctors and weeping hysterically. Ivan kissed his son's bloody face over and over, crying, "I have killed my son. I have killed my son." The royal physicians rushed into the room with bandages and herbal medicines, but the damage was far too severe. For 4 agonizing days, the young prince drifted in and out of consciousness on a bed in the fortress. Ivan never left his side, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, and praying desperately to God to take his own life instead. The young prince briefly opened his eyes, looked at his weeping father, and whispered, "I die as a devoted son and humble servant." On November 19, 1581, Tsarevich Ivan took his final breath and went completely cold. To make the nightmare even worse, the beating caused Yelena to miscarry her child the following morning, wiping out 2 generations in days. Ivan the Terrible tore his clothes, pulled out clumps of his own grey hair and banged his head against his son's wooden coffin. He walked behind the funeral procession in rags, looking like a broken ghost rather than the most powerful man in the realm. The old Tsar survived for 3 more years, but those final years were filled with non-stop nightmares, guilt, and bitter tears. He gave vast amounts of money to churches across Russia, asking priests to pray forever for the soul of the son he murdered. When Ivan finally collapsed and died over a chessboard in 1584, the consequences of that bloody night truly hit Russia. The only surviving heir was Ivan's younger son, Fyodor, a gentle and sick young man who could not manage the massive country. When Fyodor died without leaving any children, the ancient royal bloodline completely ended after hundreds of years. Russia fell straight into the time of troubles, a brutal era of famine, civil war, and foreign invasions that killed 1/3 of the population. All of that massive national suffering traced right back to 1 split second of uncontrolled rage in a stone bedchamber.